All right, thank you all. So this is the third time this has been scheduled. The first time was canceled due to tornadoes. The second time was canceled due to a death, and I really hope that's not indicative of how God feels about this content. So, but the third time here we all are with alumni, and so I'm feeling grateful in my heart that you all are here and that we are finally doing this. So welcome. And I want to just say that Dean Bridgman, even though we didn't talk, she set me up well for what I'm going to do tonight in her homily a little bit ago, in that she talked about and drew our attention to the fact that ancient Israel throughout their history was a marginalized group, facing constant pressure and terror from empires. And the ways in which they dealt with these situations varied. And so, as we're going to learn today, they often took different approaches to dealing with these pressures. And so, without further ado, we're going to get into my book, Undoing Conquest. And in a way, I'm going to invite you all back to seminary. Hebrew Bible class. Dr. Paul Kim's not here, but yeah, so some of this may sound familiar. Some of it may not, but it should be a good ride. So, Undoing Conquest is a practical theology project that spans disciplines. If you're in my design thinking class, I could say this is a metadisciplinary project, otherwise known as interdisciplinary research. I utilize in the book feminist theologies, practical theology, insights from my work in marketing and graphic design, biblical studies, and archaeological research. While these are a lot of disciplines, let me just say it is most unusual to do a practical theology project that utilizes biblical scholarship and archaeological research, especially from the Iron Age. And so I did not do this work in a vacuum. I have been in conversation with many a biblical scholar, both who've read the drafts but also worked with me on my comprehensive exams and dissertations. And so I'm not doing this alone. There's a community behind me. But yes, it is unusual to draw on archaeological research, especially from the Iron Age, think 1200 BCE, to inspire practical theology and religious practice today. But that's where we're headed. As you're going to see in this presentation, there has been some historic discoveries in the last century that change the way we understand the origins of the biblical traditions, and that this discovery is so important that it can speak to and shape our traditions today. And that's the argument that I will make. It typically takes about 100 years for paradigm-shifting discoveries to be integrated into our everyday practices and ways of thinking. And so these archaeological and biblical studies discoveries are no different. And we're nearing around the 100-year point, so I think it's time. And so, without further ado, let's hop in. First of all, I want to talk a little bit about that I'm drawn to this work precisely because of my background in graphic design, but also as a queer person and a queer feminist theologian. Why? Because I'm very interested in how stories get told, who tells them and why, and how stories can shape communities. I worked on these topics in the business world via branding and marketing. Brands are just big stories that corporations tell about who they are and what they do, and they do it symbolically. And so there's some real parallels to what we do in theology in what's happening in the business world, whether we want to accept that or not. And so this shapes my theological work. But as a queer person, I know what it's like to be marginalized by the church and to have biblical passages used as a weapon. And I consider the Conquest narrative in the book of Joshua to be the worst of the clobber passages, if you will, in the ways in which Christian empires and colonialists have wielded it to colonize lands and commit genocide with theological impunity. Lastly, as a feminist and a queer theologian, I am attuned to the stories from the margins that have been oppressed and remain untold from the dominant narratives, and the importance of telling new histories and reshaping our traditions to better align with our ethics of justice and flourishing. And so for all these reasons, I've written Undoing Conquest. So let's dive into what the book is about. To begin, we need to think about violence in the Bible. And in particular, what I name as a clobber passage, the conquest narrative in the book of Joshua. So most likely we all have some idea of what I'm talking about, but let's just do a little recap. So the text in particular I'm thinking about is Joshua 3 through 9, which takes place after the Exodus in the wilderness. This is where God calls the Israelites to conquer the land of Canaan. In this call, God raises up the Israelite army in a holy war to take the land, to kill all the inhabitants as a sacrifice called the harem to God. And in this sacrifice, it includes killing all the women, the men, the children, and even the livestock. So nothing was to remain alive. And this is the story where then we get sort of the famous idea of Jericho's walls tumbling down. And so as the story is narrated along, the Israelite army goes from city to city, destroying each city as God commanded. Now, this story, as violent as it is in the Bible, our problem is that it has a very violent afterlife, especially in the hands of Christian empires. Here in the United States, our history is riddled with the conquest narrative. It shapes some of our fundamental myths, the myth of manifest destiny, the idea of going westward, taking the land, pushing out the indigenous peoples, killing the indigenous peoples. When the Puritans landed in New England, we can hear echoed in their early sermons that they saw their mission here as taking over a new promised land. They read themselves as the new Israelites, and of course, the American Indian and Native American peoples as the Canaanites that God allowed them to destroy at will. And so the story became a story in the imagination of empire. We see it in South Africa when the Afrikaners were moving inland into South Africa. They used the conquest narrative to shape and give meaning to what they were doing in their colonizing acts and displacement and murder of indigenous African peoples. And it still has influence today. This is an image from the Jericho March on January 6th, where a group called the Jericho March actually went to Washington, D.C., blowing the shofars, just as Joshua did in the stories, around government buildings, seeking to take back and hope to destroy the government buildings, taking them back for God. And so it's very much alive and well. And of course, we see this in the current conflict in Israel and Gaza, where Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has repeatedly referenced the conquest story as justification for the continued war in Gaza. This isn't all we're seeing, though. We're seeing something else when it comes to the long histories of colonialism and conquest. There is beginning to be a movement among churches and other groups to seek reconciliation, repair, and reparations for the past. Here we can see Pope Francis. This was during his July 2022 papal tour of Canada, where he sought to apologize for the atrocities of boarding schools, Catholic boarding schools, on the indigenous populations there. And so it's the beginning of a much broader and bigger needed process that we all need to be part of. And so I'm sure many of us could think of other ways that conquest is showing up today. So I'm going to invite us today into 3 content parts that's going to take us through what's going on in the book. Content part number 1 is archaeology and conquest. And so here's where we're going back to seminary. Let's talk about, first of all, the time period I'm going to talk about. This is the time period of right at the end of the late Bronze Age, around 1200 BCE, the beginning of what's known as the Iron Age. The location is the ancient Near East, so you've got the Egyptian Empire to the south, but we're interested in the ancient land of Canaan, or current-day Israel and Palestine. Leading up to the Iron Age was the late Bronze Age, where Egypt ruled this entire area that I have circled and down into the Nile Delta region. And they ruled this region through city-states. And so here's an example, Megiddo. This is the ruins of Megiddo, which is located in southern Galilee in an area of rich farmland. This is where biblical Armageddon gets its name, from Megiddo. During the late Bronze Age, Megiddo was a palace city-state that was ruled by Egypt by local vassal kings. The ways in which things were set up was that it was a very steep hierarchy, where the urban palace elites on one hand hoarded all of the wealth and resources, and the rural poor, which was about 80% of the people, were economically oppressed and sometimes even needed to sell themselves into slavery to pay their debts. And so in this region, there was multiple city-states that were doing this. And we get a real window into this period by something called the Amarna tablets. Has anyone heard of the Amarna tablets? Okay. So for those of you that have not, these are very fascinating. Basically, we got a window into Pharaoh's inbox at the time. And what these texts tell us is that these texts are correspondence from those Canaanite city-states, the kings there, and other places around the region, but for our interests, we're talking about Canaan. They would write Pharaoh and say, "Oh, things are bad. You need to send us some grain. Actually, you need to send us like 500 horsemen to come up here and settle some unrest." And so they would be writing him and asking for help because they're paying tribute, and so they're expecting stuff in return. So the Amarna tablets give us Pharaoh's inbox. We don't know what the Pharaoh actually did, but we know what was happening on the ground in this region a few hundred years before this time. So we know there was civil unrest. We also know that there was an interesting group of people known as the Habiru. There's a couple different ways to pronounce it. These were folks that were basically a group of social bandits made up likely of escaped slaves, bandits, or raiders, and they would often raid these city-states, causing unrest, stealing supplies. And the Habiru stories, when I hear them, remind me a little bit of Robin Hood and his merry men, kind of stealing from the rich. That's one way to think about it. But basically, we hear from these kings that the Habiru are causing trouble. And we also notice something interesting, that sometimes other kings can be called out as being Habiru. And so there's sort of a fluidity to this term. And so this is all kind of in the air leading up to 1200 BCE. Then something happens around 1175, 1200. The Egyptian empire begins to collapse. Seems like it kind of comes out of nowhere. A lot of folks wrote about this, scholars wondering why did this collapse happen. But about 14 years ago, we got a window into one of the causes, climate change. Archaeobotanists studying pollen core samples from the bottom of the Sea of Galilee discovered that there was a massive drought that lasted around 150 years during this time period. Other geologists, geological research discovered that the ice sheets off of Greenland melted during this time, causing a warming in the Mediterranean and an extreme climate change that, again, correlates with this time period. And so now we have a period of climate change. We already have a period of extreme economic injustice, collapse of the ruling powers, and now a climate change which is leading to migrating peoples and overall instability. Sound familiar at all? And so this is the time period where archaeologists make an unexpected discovery, a hidden history, if you will. Not quite at the level of the Da Vinci Code, but I kind of nerd out about it in the same way. What archaeologists discovered is that right as the Egyptian Empire and all of this unrest is happening, something unique is happening in the highland regions of Canaan. They start to discover many new settlements. Hundreds of little villages are starting to crop up, small little villages that are created very often in a circular pattern, built from farmhouses. And they're not a fortified group. They're not noticing any weapons or any hierarchical luxury goods, palaces, anything that you're seeing down below in like Megiddo, not showing up in these highlands. But the locale is very close. So here is a topographic map of current-day Israel and Palestine. And you can see here, the city-states were located mostly in this rich, fertile land. But just about, a few kilometers away, up into what's known as the Rocky Highlands, that's where these villages start cropping up. And we believe they did so because they were relatively unbothered by Egypt, because horses and chariots really can't get up into the Rocky Highlands, and that's the truth. And so as long as Egypt, even as it's collapsing, was able to maintain control of the fertile farmland region and a trade route there, they didn't really care what was happening up in the highlands. And so this gave an opportunity for these highland settlements to spread for around 150 years. A fundamental aspect of this archaeological research that archaeologists and biblical scholars have been wrestling with is that it fundamentally contradicts the story of conquest. Rather than conquest at the origins of the Israelite tradition, we see a new settlement pattern, a peaceful, somewhat peaceful settlement pattern. We see hundreds of villages. We don't see the destruction of cities. We see hundreds of villages cropping up, small, less than 1 hectare. The sites are unfortified. There's no weapons or militaristic fortification to be found anywhere across these settlements. The reason they were built into the circular pattern was that the outer walls of the houses acted to create an inner courtyard where you could keep children and animals in, and you could keep wild animals and intruders out. But these were not militaristic walls. If you go to the Harvard Ancient Near Eastern Museum in Cambridge, Mass., you can actually see this model of a Hebrew farmhouse. This is a new development of a farmhouse to the period. They didn't invent it, but this is the first time we see this farmhouse being spread prolifically in villages. And so it's been nicknamed the Hebrew farmhouse. And each of these houses would contain a pretty big family, intergenerational family, and there would be about maybe 10 to 12 of these houses in a settlement. So they're small settlements. Here's one built into the side of a hill, a little bit more of a square featured one. But who were these settlers? Scholars think that these settlers, they call them proto-Israelite in a way, that these first folks moving out into these settlements were the very beginnings of what would later become the Israelite people. And who were they? What can archaeologists tell us about this? Well, first of all, based on the artifacts found across the settlements, they were using very similar pottery artifacts and wares from the Canaanites below. And so you have collared rim, jars found everywhere. This is the Canaanite style of pottery. And so it's assumed that many of these people inhabiting these settlements were coming from the lowlands of Canaan, most likely escaping the collapse that was happening or the severe economic oppression. You see that this group also likely included others, not just the lowland Canaanites, but it seems like others were coming in because the population explosion was such that it was beyond just natural reproductive cycles, that other people from different parts were moving in, which leads some scholars to call it a motley crew of people, different cultural identities, all coming together, seeking a different way of life, right as they're dealing with some extreme problems, including climate change. And so they're faced with climate change and the collapse of the Egyptian empire. So how did they survive this rocky, arid region? They started to leverage new technologies. These weren't technologies that they invented, but it's the first time we see them at scale in the region. The first technology you see here, terraced agriculture. They were able to backfill and create retaining walls so they could create small crops for substance. How were they able to grow crops when we're dealing with as little as 4 inches of rainfall a year? Another new technology, chalk-lined cisterns. Now, they used to have wells during this period, but the innovation is chalk lining. Once you were able to chalk line these stone wells, you could preserve water for a long period of time. And so this enabled them to gather what little water was there to use throughout the year and to provide some irrigation to their crops. And of course, they had a pastoral element as well, so they have sheep, goats, other things. So they were able to survive even though there was these harsh conditions. The other thing about these settlements that scholars find interesting is that they used also what is known as democratizing technologies. So what are these? The first is iron, hence we're in the Iron Age. The Bronze Age, bronze was the dominant form of metalsmithing. Bronze was very expensive and very hard to procure, and it was a metal for the empire. Average people didn't have access to it unless they had expensive palace workshops. Ironworking, on the other hand, enabled local itinerant blacksmiths to be able to go around and create tools for the people. This wasn't possible before. And so the first time during this period, people like these settlers could gain access to iron plow tips, iron tools to dig out wells. Again, not possible before. Another democratizing technology that the settlers started to develop was their own written language. Just like bronze was limited to the palace states, so was language at this time, written language. Written language, when we think of this time period, we can think of cuneiform or Egyptian hieroglyph, very difficult written languages that were only available for the palace elites again. And the languages, written languages really was a tool of empire to keep track of the administrative state. What we see around this time period is people starting to develop their own written language so they can start to write their own texts, their own stories. And we see this starting to come up within these settlements. This is actually a practice abecedary, if you will, written on a piece of old pottery, the oldest piece of ancient Hebrew that we have that scholars think come from this time period. So they're starting to develop their own culture. The other thing that's noticed about this cultural development is that they're applying what I'm calling justice-oriented living practices. It's not completely egalitarian, but there's a utopic flair to what is happening in these settlements. There seems to be a self-conscious sense of being that they're not doing what was happening in empire. They're doing something different. And you can hear those echoes in the Hebrew text. You can hear those echoes in the prophetic texts that are talking about, we're not doing what the empires were doing. We're taking care of each other. It's an open circle for folks. And so this type of living pattern seemed to be evident in the fact that, as I said earlier, no hierarchical palaces, no big administrative state, no luxury goods are found in the settlements. The graves, nobody's being buried with luxury goods. And so it seems like men and women's graves are similar, and there's not, and so that type of evidence bases scholars to argue that this was a non-hierarchical way of living. Also, no warring materials. As I said, no fortification of walls. Also, there's no weapons to be found. So this isn't a warring people. This isn't the Israelite army going in and invading Canaan. And so out of these settlements, a new culture starts to develop, known through what's known as an ethnogenesis process, where new peoples come together, they start to create their own stories and their own ways of meaning, their own ways of living, and a new ethnic identity starts to form. And this, out of these Hebrew highland settlements that were considered proto-Israelite, this is where the Israelite identity in religion and then historical practices emerge from. Okay, so that's part one. Is there any burning questions before we move on to part two? Okay. See how we're doing after lunch here. I won't be offended if anyone has to catch a quick snooze. Okay. So, all of this research basically led me to the question, and others, if the conquest didn't happen, then why is it in the Bible? How do we end up with this story? And to answer that question, I first want to frame the conversation that I started with about stories shaping us and the power of stories. And stories can be twofold. Oppressive stories can perpetuate oppression. But liberative stories can challenge the status quo. They can call us to be something better than where we are right now. The same is true for history. How we imagine history shapes us. We're seeing this play out right now in our current culture. The 1619 Project, a project that wants to tell marginalized stories of American history. Tell the stories of enslaved African American peoples. Tell the stories of resistance. Tell the stories that weren't told by the powers that told history. One of the last things that the Trump administration did before he left office in January 2021 was put out the 1776 report, which is a whitewash telling of American history. And you see right here, the crusade against American history, read the 1619 Project, is toxic propaganda, ideological poison. And so there's real rhetoric around whose story gets to be told, whose history gets to be told, whose history is propaganda and whose history isn't propaganda. And so we're talking about a battle for history, and we're seeing it, as I said, play out right now. But this isn't an old battle. People have been imagining histories for a very long time and knowing the power of history. And so when we think about the Conquest story, we have to keep in mind this notion of history writing, how we tell our story and why. And so to get at the bottom of where the Conquest narrative started, we have to go through some long spans of history. We're talking almost 500 years from when these first settlers broke ground in the highlands of Canaan. A lot of history has happened here, and we're certainly not going to have time for it today. But in a very thumbnail, we have a history of a united kingdom. We have a moment in time where these highland settlers, who started out within this non-hierarchical way of organizing, through the pressures, not of the Egyptian Empire, but of invading sea peoples or the Philistines, felt pressure and felt the need to have a king. And so we can read this in 1 Samuel 8, that there's a tension in these early communities about wanting a king, wanting to feel protected, and the prophet saying, no, we left kings. We don't want to do kings. We know what happens when there's a king. They hoard all the wealth. They make you fight in their army. They enslave you to build their buildings. But there was this threat, very real threat, and people were scared, and they were like, no, we need protection. And so this starts a period of history where there's a kingdom, a united kingdom at first, Saul, David, and Solomon. But very quickly, we have two kingdoms. The kingdom of Israel to the north, and the kingdom of Judah to the south. And so we're in a period of around, I think, 200 years where there's two kingdoms happening. So again, so much history, a lot of prophetic voices happening during this period that, again, we're not going to be able to get to. But I want us to get to 722. 722, something happens. The Assyrians, one of the empires that rose to power during this time, a very horrific and terrorizing empire, conquers the northern region of Israel. And the Assyrians were a brute force, and they are known for their carnage and their siege warfare techniques, including battering rams, breaching fortified cities. And they use psychological warfare and terror by displaying brutal displays of violence, mass deportations of conquered populations, effectively quelling resistance to their own conquests. And so this is happening in the north. These are just images of terror, people being put on pikes, tactics of religious warfare. Very often the Assyrians would go into these smaller communities. They would allow people to keep their own religions, but they would tweak it. Say, you know what, this God you have is great, but just know your God worships our God, Asher, or our main God. So it created this pantheon, a hierarchical pantheon, which inevitably it was a practical theology of sorts that shifted local practices. So we're seeing this play out in the north, and during an 80-year period, from 722 to about 640, which is where, we get a next important historical moment, which is the reign of King Josiah. And this is where many scholars think that the conquest story emerged. So we're already seeing conquest happening in the region. The results of that conquest was that the southern part of Judah, particularly its historic center, Jerusalem, has an influx of refugees who are traumatized because of experiencing Assyrian trauma. These refugees brought their religious ideas, particularly from the prophet Hosea, who reasoned that it was Israel's unfaithfulness to their God, which was the reason why they got conquered from Assyria. So we've got these theological interpretations coming. And they brought with them the trauma. As discussed, the Assyrians were brutal. And something else happened during this time. With Assyria controlling the north, they suddenly took an interest in the resources that Judah had. And a market began to crop up for Jerusalem, for luxury goods and olive oil. And this is the first time in history that Jerusalem starts to get wealthy. And during this 80-year period, cash starts to flow in. The Assyrians start to take notice. And so for the first time, we start to see an elite class emerging in Jerusalem at this time during this 80-year period. We're simultaneously experiencing another power vacuum. Just as the Egyptian empire collapsed at the end of the Bronze Age, something's starting to happen here. There's starting to be a collapse. And within this power vacuum starts to emerge, particularly from this new elite class in Jerusalem, political ambitions. We can think of them as political ambitions, but we can't think of them without thinking about trauma. So paired with traumatized people, this new influx of wealth and the development of a wealthy elite class, folks in Jerusalem started thinking, perhaps this tiny kingdom of Judah could finally stop being bullied by empires, Egypt and Assyria, and finally make a go at being part of the powerful. And so they would start by first trying to reconquer the north, but then maybe hopefully build some alliances with folks like Egypt so that the next ruling power they could be on the ground with. Instead of being conquered, they could be part of it. And so it's this vision that King Josiah enters the scene. 2 Kings 22 tells us about King Josiah. He was 8 years old when he began to reign. What happened? His father was killed by a group. Scholars think it was this group of elite folks that wanted to get, this new vision for their future in line with the kingship. And so by putting an 8-year-old on the throne, they were able to develop and enact a series of reforms. And so if you read 2 Kings 22, it really gives us a window into this time period and what was happening. And very early on, you'll read that King Josiah, in his 18th year, set out to reform the temple. And guess what happened as he's reforming the temple? He finds a lost book that just so happens to tell the Israelites they were doing it all wrong. And this book is actually the right way to do things. And oh my God, it had been buried in the temple for decades. Okay, so we already maybe are applying a hermeneutic of suspicion towards this, and rightfully so. This was a common motif in the ancient Near East. Whenever a reforming king or group of people wanted to enact reforms, they very often found a lost book. And so this is no different. And so what this lost book led to was a series of cultic and religious reforms, but also a centralization of the tradition. And so you see, at least according to 2 Kings 22, that the central powers of Jerusalem go out into the land and wipe out all of the other religious leaders, all of the religious ways of practicing, and said, everyone has to come to Jerusalem. This is how we practice our religion. Why would they want to do that? Well, scholars argue if you want to create enough resources to make yourself a mini power in the region, you need money and you need an army. How do you get that? Bring everybody to one place, you can tax them, and you can pick out the young, strong people for your army. And so centralizing the religion had a political component to it. And so this vast corpus of reforms and even writing is known as, back into our Hebrew Bible scholarship days, the Deuteronomistic history, the Deuteronomistic reforms. And so there was a lot of text production happening. And during this time period, scholars think that most likely an early edition of Joshua or the Conquest narrative got drafted. And it was drafted with a specific intent, to juxtapose Josiah and his reforms to the historical character of Joshua, and to say, look, our real history is that of a conquering people. Our real history is that God told us to destroy nations just like Assyria destroyed nations. We are just like them. And therefore, when Josiah says, let's go, we're going to go out and live into this, that there is a historical precedence, a new history that's cast into the image of conquest. And all this makes sense when we understand that this is a traumatized people who have been living under the oppression of empire for 500 years. And so it's easy for us to be like, wow, that was a bad thing to do. Why are you paving over this liberative historical element? But when we understand through layers of trauma, like the biblical scholar David Carr does, it makes every bit of sense why you would want to rewrite your history and recast it in the image of the Assyrians. And the book of Joshua very much reads like an Assyrian conquest tale. It borrows from that rhetoric. And so that's also why scholars want to say this is much later. It has to be written in this time period. And so Josiah institutes his reforms. Josiah and the people behind him. How far those reforms went, we don't know. 2 Kings likes to tell us it went pretty far, but whether we can believe that or not. And then after all of this work, Josiah marches out to meet with Egypt and hopefully create an alliance, and he's shot dead on the battlefield with an arrow. And so we're talking 40 years of Reformation, 40 years of text writing, basically ending with an arrow on the field. And then something else happened, pretty close to Josiah's reforms and death. Does anybody know what that other thing might have been? Any history buffs out there? You have a... Yep, Babylon. Well, the power vacuum didn't last long. Babylon steps into this power vacuum, and very shortly after Josiah's death and reforms, we have the beginnings of Babylon conquering Judah, and eventually the Babylonian exile about 15 years later. And so you have a people now without a land, a people with a bunch of texts and scrolls, part of them new scrolls from the Deuteronomistic writings, part of them prophetic northern scrolls, part of them just a collection of what they had, going into the Babylonian exile and really sitting with what do we do now. And so I'm going to pause there in terms of our history lesson, and I'm going to bring us back to today. And I ask the question, as a queer theologian, how can this information shape our faith today? Because part of this information is a liberative story. You have a story of people dealing with empire and saying, we are going to not do empire. We're going to do something different. We're going to build small communities. We are going to have an ethos that's anti-empire, if you will. And then you see another response to empire, which is, we need a strong man. We need an authoritarian. We need a history that can prop us up in the face of terror. We need to mimic the violence that was done to us as a means of safety. There's something to learn from that, too. And so both of these come together, and they provide, I think, impetus for us to shape our faith today. But yet, as I looked around as a practical theologian when I was doing this work, I hadn't yet seen this taking part within our churches. And I think there's good reason for that, as I said before. It's new information. What do we do with it? And so I started thinking about the ways in which this information might make its way into the church. But as you can see through this lecture, I'm at almost 40 minutes. This is dense information. It invites a lot of history. Yeah, amen. Ooh, it's a marathon up here. But the exciting part is that it invites biblical literacy. We get to know where these texts came from. Where did this prophetic voice come from? Why is it in tension with these other voices in the biblical text? Why is it that there's these competing visions in the Israelite tradition? We can start to parse it out. This information gives us sort of a way of interpreting that can be really rich, but then it's also right in line with many of the issues we're facing today. But this isn't a sermon series. This isn't one book talk. We need to change the way we're practicing our faith. And so, of course, I found inspiration from Coca-Cola. Right? I mean, who wouldn't? I'll just leave that hanging for a while. Okay. Bingo. Spoiler alert. Okay. When we think of Christmas, we think of Santa. We think of the jolly elf. We think of the red coat. We think of all of these things. And the reason we think of them is because of Coca-Cola. In the 1930s, Coke decided they weren't just a drink for summer. They wanted to be a drink for all year round. And so they rolled out a Christmas campaign and said, how can we make Coke enticing in the middle of winter? Well, let's take this figure of St. Nick, who was kind of peripheral to the season. He did exist, but they were like, let's make Santa a thing. And so they hired this famous illustrator, Harold Sundblom, and they hired him to create these iconic images of Santa. And then they spent millions, probably closer to billions in today's term, every year rolling out this campaign of Santa. And they just marketed it everywhere until it became iconic with Christmas. This is why we have mall Santas. If it wasn't for Coke, there would not be mall Santas. And so every year they rolled out a seasonal campaign. And they were able to shape the collective imaginary around the globe because they hit it every year. And so we don't have billions of dollars for marketing in the church, right? At least, I don't know, maybe some of you do. Talk to me after. But we're pretty darn good at seasonal liturgies. And so I propose at the end of the book to bring this information to our churches. We need to do it in a way that has enough depth that we can get there with folks, but that it must return every year. And then we can build on it. And so I propose at the end of my book what I call a season of origins. Origins is a 4-week season like Advent, and each week has a particular theme, and that these themes invite us into the biblical text, but also into our current situation, and they also call us to the justice work that needs to happen in our churches to deal with the legacies of colonialism and conquest in the Christian tradition. And so the first season of origins is I name Invite. Here is a week where we can invite Highland settlement stories and other liberative stories into the life of the church. Name is a week of naming the atrocities of the past, taking responsibility for past harms, which moves into repair. What do we need to do to repair the harms of the past? Reparations or other justice-seeking actions. And then the 4th week turns to imagine. Where do we want to go? What kind of people do we want to be? How do we imagine a more just way forward into the future? And so taken together, these themes can be returned to every year, and you can build on them with a way of going deep and continuing to invite these themes every year. I propose that the season occurs in October during a period of time that's now named as ordinary time, and that it would ground our calendar, the origins of it within the origins of the Hebrew people coming before Advent, and that it would align with, in some ways, with the reparative and healing work that our Jewish brothers and sisters are doing during this season. That it would also align and coincide with Indigenous Peoples Day. And so this season, I start to chart out in the book. I provide an outline of how it could go. But there's much more work to be done. And so I just applied for a grant this season with the Louisville Institute to roll out a season of origins in the fall 2025 with these 5 churches: Myrtle Baptist Church, a historic black church outside of Boston; Norman First American United Methodist Church, which is a predominantly Native American Oklahoma; St. John's Episcopal Church, a church on a historic women's college campus with many LGBTQ plus members; the Riverside Church in New York City, a historic urban and interdenominational interracial church; and then the Hilliard United Methodist Church, right here in the area, a predominantly white and suburban church. And so this research project will bring these folks together. We'll start to chart out in a communal way different liturgies, different ways in which the season could move forward, and then we'll test it next fall in the different congregations to see what we can learn from it so that we can hopefully develop resources in ways in which other churches could start to roll it out. And I'll end with this. Season of Origins now. Right now, a church quite close to us, Blue Ocean Faith in Columbus, with Reverend Dr. Ben Hulleskamp, a student here, learned about Season of Origins in my class, and he was like, I'm going to do it. So he's the very first church to be running this. Right now, I'll be preaching there on Sunday, if anybody's interested. And they are in their 4th week of Origins, I believe. So it's pretty exciting. But yeah, thank you for your attention. We covered a lot of ground.
So before I say anything else about Dr. Common's wonderful book, I want to share my admiration for it that comes out of my experience as a pastor. One of my eternal frustrations as a pastor was that there were so many important and relevant ideas that I had encountered in seminary that I just didn't know how to translate into preaching or teaching in a way that a congregation could understand and benefit from. A scholar that Dr. Common didn't mention in her talk today, but that you'll see repeatedly footnoted in her book, is Norman Gottwald's The Tribes of Yahweh. This is a book that when I encountered it in seminary, Gottwald has this provocative thesis that the early Hebrews were not, in fact, invaders who overpowered and decimated the Canaanites, but that they were actually Canaanites themselves who chose a different way of life and formed a new kind of community. So this theory has been out there for decades, and I found it compelling and potentially transformative. But, you know, the Tribes of Yahweh is 968 pages long. and I didn't know how to make its ideas accessible to ordinary people. In Undoing Conquest, Dr. Common has done just that. This is a book that has those ideas in it, but it's compact and accessible enough for a Lenten study. It's eminently quotable in sermons, and as she's indicated, it's full of ideas for helping congregations integrate an updated version of this argument into their thought and practice. So, Dr. Common, thank you. Next, as an historian of American Christianity, I'd like to highlight something else that's important in Dr. Common's book that she didn't have time to say a whole lot about today, but that is the role of this story of conquest in the history of the United States. Dr. Common writes in her first chapter, the United States is considered secular, but it is a veneered secularity. Christian theological themes interweave U.S. history and its ethos so deeply that they are hardly noticeable. Latent theological themes, myths, and doctrines, like the Protestant work ethic, manifest destiny, the myth of progress, the doctrine of discovery. I would add the idea of the United States as a redeemer nation. These all come from a Christian theological imagination that generates the scaffolds of the dominant U.S. ethos. Scratch the surface of these underlying theological themes, and not far below, the conquest narrative rests. This imagery of veneers and scaffolds, I think, is so important for understanding the role of the Bible in the American Christian imagination. Consciously and unconsciously, we identify ourselves with the Bible's protagonists, and we use its narrative arcs to make sense of our own history. We are always trying to plot out our historical experience along a line that begins in the Garden of Eden and ends in the New Jerusalem. The stories of the Bible become the frames that give our own stories their shape. And the Conquest, as Dr. Kamen points out, has been an extremely powerful story in American history. Europeans migrating to the Americas, and especially English Protestants who migrated to North America to settle, indeed figured themselves as the people of Israel, the land as Canaan, and Native Americans as the Canaanites whom God had commanded them to exterminate. In 1676, for example, Increase Mather began his brief history of the war with the Indians in New England by describing the Narragansetts and Wampanoags as the heathen people amongst whom we live and whose land the Lord God of our fathers hath given to us for a rightful possession. One caveat, though, that I would add is that this identification with the conquering Israelites, while extremely dominant, has never been universal or complete. Depending on who you ask and when you ask them, America has also been the Garden of Eden, Egypt, Babylon, Rome, and the New Jerusalem. I would argue that the Conquest story is a very specific and sharp weapon that gets unsheathed when white people want more land. French Jesuits in 17th and 18th century New France, for example, did not figure Native Americans as Canaanites because they were embedded in a fur trading economy that didn't require settling or owning land. And their economy did require Native American participation. Which is not to say that they were not racist, that they did not oppress Native Americans, but because they weren't, because it wasn't driven by this desire for land, this was not the story that they went to. The Puritans did not necessarily arrive on this continent immediately identifying themselves with Joshua and the Native Americans with the Canaanites. Some English migrants early on speculated that the Native American people were the lost tribes of Israel, or imagined them as Gentiles ripe for conversion. The rhetorical and physical brutality developed as a growing English population demanded more land for building and farming. The Conquest story has not always and everywhere been foregrounded. The times that it has come to the fore have been specific moments of a power struggle over land. Dr. Kamm is absolutely correct that the Conquest story teaches and reinforces a notion that land is there for the taking and that the slaughter of indigenous people is not only justified but blessed. And she offers a prophetic proposal for undoing this story in the Christian imagination. I do think, though, that there's also a kind of chicken and egg question to consider. Has the Conquest story led European Christians to conquer? Or has the European Christian desire to conquer led us to zero in on this conquest story to the exclusion of all other stories, even to ignore the counter-narratives that are layered within it, such as the story of Rahab, who lived in the Jericho city wall and helped the Israelites, and whose family they spared. This is another question that I think we can fruitfully pose to our congregations. In addition to helping them interrogate the story and its consequences, we can also interrogate ourselves. What are the desires and the interests that lead us to identify with one set of characters in the Bible and not another? And if a particular Bible story seems to hold outsized explanatory power or to justify violence, what is it in us that leads us there and not somewhere else? Why Joshua and not Amos or Isaiah or Jesus? What is motivating us? To truly undo conquest, I think we need to not only see what is wrong with the story, but also what is wrong with us.
Well, good afternoon. First, thank you, Dr. Common, for your insightful and stimulating work, and thank you, everyone, for being here. I just prepared a written note in response to Dr. Kate Common's book, which you should all read, and that's the most important thing that I will say to you. So, The Undoing Conquest. This is a book that invites the deeper engagement with the topics of Israelite history and the Bible and the new imagination of liberative church practice. As a practical theologian, Dr. Common has done thought-provoking work on feminist practical theology, drawing on interdisciplinary effort that engage the Bible, biblical scholarship, and archaeological research. And as we've already heard, her work really highlights the power of story, history, and written text. As Dr. Common points out, stories shape us. Stories shape our identity and our collective or social imagination. And in Western culture, biblical narratives, the stories in the religious and sacred texts play a pivotal role in shaping our social constructions. The power of stories reveals their significant influence on our social construction and imagination, while also warning the destructive impact when the violent stories become the dominant narrative in a society. So the Undoing Conquest begins with Dr. Common's concern about the Israelite conquest narrative in the book of Joshua, its ongoing role in supporting the patterns and practice of colonialism, land-taking, and genocide, and the erasure of the non-militaristic origin story of Hebrew highland settlers. So her sharp analysis of the emergence of the conquest narrative in the 7th century Judean context highlights both its parallels with European settlers' appropriation of a Jewish hope and its continued influence on America's master's narrative. As Dr. Common explained, the conquest narrative develops as a part of a Deuteronomistic history and the Josianic reform by the elite and scribal class. Although Judah witnesses the Assyrians terrorizing and destroying the northern kingdom of Israel, the traumatic violence unfortunately led the Deuteronomists to envision a unified state in a way that mimicked Assyrian imperialistic conquest. And you may recognize the Josianic reform as an effort to restore the Yahweh-only traditions in Israeli cultic practice and the Deuteronomistic historians as a group of scholars who shaped the theological framework of Yahweh's monotheism. However, Dr. Common's work highlights the Deuteronomistic historical rebranding that support the Judean nationalist and expansionist ambitions. And this kind of strategic historiography is not unfamiliar to us. As noted in this book, Dr. Common's work draws parallels with the stories of early European settlers in the US. So Christianity entered the Americas during the conquest of the New World, functioning as the ideological bias for transforming the land and assimilating indigenous people into the new social order being imposed. And while the European settlers constructed the new social order and new identity in the new land based on scripture, the stories from the sacred text, they anonymously identified the white settlers with Israel, a chosen people, and overlooked the destructive power and later violence inherited in the conquest narrative and their use of these sacred texts in the name of God's will. And their misguided desire, ideological historiography, and imperialistic Christian imagination remind us of how the conquest narrative developed and suppressed the stories of indigenous Canaanites, the highland settlers. However, Dr. Common's insight goes even further. As a constructive theologian working on intergenerational and immigrant trauma in Asian diaspora community, I see potential for extending the conversation into American world discourse, the ongoing history of American militarism and imperialism in Asia, and the haunting traumatic wounds in immigrant communities. The conquest story in the Bible not only impacts the shaping of the early European settler story in the US, but it continues to influence the shaping of American master's narrative and its support of American military imperialism beyond its border. Since the First World War, the United States has engaged in various foreign wars in the land outside its own soil, under the pretext of war against communism and later against terrorism. Amidst such later violence, it is the Christian stories, the conquest narrative, that has supported, sustained, and justified US military expansion and the fantasy of mastery that the US holds. The ideology was simple. The blessed and civilized West redeemed Asia from communists and later terrorist power. Here, the Christianity assisted the myth of American redemptive violence and the civilizing mission of US imperialism by identifying democracy and civilization with lofty principle while equating communism with barbaric, order, and in opposition to Christian values. While this sacred conquest narrative support American redemptive violence, the stories of massacres and indiscriminate bombings committed by the US militarism in Asia, especially during the Korean and Vietnam War, stand as an uncomfortable truth that had to be forgotten and should not have been revealed in history. In the rise of new militarized empire in the later half of the 20th century, the Christian conquest narrative supported American myth of redemptive violence, rendering Asian civilians' life unreal and ungrievable. However, the stories and memories of the laws that America tried to suppress, erase, and bury in Asian soils continue to haunt the US society. These violent, traumatic wounds have traveled across countries and generations through early Asian immigrants who carried the traumatic memories of war with them. And of course, after migrations, their unreal life stories encounter another violence, the violence of assimilation. that force them to continue repressing the untold truth and then the narrative and narrate their lives within the plot of America's master narrative. Yet none of us may be free from the aftermath of Conquest narrative, the mourning sounds of traumatic wounds, and their whispers asking us to witness the place where silence and the shadows of death remain in immigrant communities. As Dr. Kamen argues, we need a liberating counter-history, the Highland settlement history that challenges the dominant conquest narrative and imperialistic Christian imagination. We need a story. We need a story of indigenous canonized that does not celebrate the first redemptive violence, but instead witness God's liberating work in Exodus. By placing the hidden and repressed story of the Highland settlement that Dr. Kamen uncovered at the center of Christian narrative, we can transform our social imagination towards something radically different. And in this radical imagination, we may discover ways to connect the hidden stories in our society with the hidden stories in Christian tradition. And these hidden and untold stories will guide us in witnessing God's ongoing liberation for those who carry these stories and lead us to envision God's transformation through utopic imagination and practices. And Dr. Kamen's book, Undoing Conquest, showed me this possibility.
So I think I don't know what time we're supposed to end up, but I'm sure everybody's probably ready to. Okay, so we're doing okay. All right, cool. Never mind. All right. I'm not going to extend my time, but I just want to make sure that we're running on time. Again, I want to thank Dr. Kamen for such an amazing piece of scholarship and for the opportunity to participate in a panel. I had the privilege of actually just having her speak to me about how the ideas of the book began to germinate within her. And I think in that conversation, you can always, at least for me, speaking to someone when they're excited about their own work, still after it's published, just tells you the ways in which that there's still power and resonance in the text. And that's what I felt when I read it. I titled my little response as The Season of Origins because, as I will share at the end of my talk, the last section of the book really sat with me and was really inspirational for me as someone who is a full-time pastor at a church in Los Angeles. Dr. Kamen writes in the beginning of the book, the stories we tell shape our identities, who we are as a people, and what we come to expect in this world. Stories told together hold us together, shaping our collective imaginations. As the opening words of the preface, I find that these to be deeply compelling and reminded me to contemplate the own stories that have shaped my own life, that have led me here, stories that I talk about in my own work, but stories that continue to shape who I am today. I talk and write frequently about my grandfather and the ways in which that his origin story as a migrant picker from Brookhaven, Mississippi, moving his family to Michigan, escaping death threats, and ultimately getting a job in a factory is what enabled my family to move out of generational poverty to just being poor. And it is his story, his commitment to his own spirituality, his commitment to the earth that has really inspired me to be here today. It's a story that I pass on to my son, and a story that I believe I see growing within him. But yet and still, that my maternal grandfather's story is not the only story that I carry. As the quote says, it's about how we tell those true stories about who we are, because these stories do hold us together. This is a picture of my great-grandfather on my father's side. Joe was he passed away, but Joe is a Spanish immigrant from the northeastern region of Spain. And for all intents and purposes, we would identify him as white. This was something that was not known to me until I was an adult, because my parents got divorced when I was a kid, and I was raised by an amazing stepfather. But what I did know as I began to do research for my book and began to think critically about the experiences of my grandfather, I wanted to know more about my father's family, and now I know why we were all so light-skinned, is because this is what our ancestry is, the complexity of it. But really what settled with me, or what I should say was unsettling for me, was the fact that Joe married a mixed race, what we identify as black, but a mixed race person that worked on the plantation where he was the driver. And so I have these competing narratives that sit within me. On the one hand, I come from descendants of people who were brought here, enslaved to the land, tied to the cotton, as you see in the background of this picture. Now, on the other hand, I am descendants of folk who are from an imperial power who did so much terror on people and within our own country, and also within Central and South America. And so how do I hold these two truths together? How can I in myself recognize that these two narratives and stories exist within me? I find that most of us in our truest moments recognize that we each hold these kind of complex realities within us, and it's our ability or inability to attend to and address those complexities that can allow us to grow. I find this to be where we are as a nation, and it's exemplified in the work you've done. We have these multiple competing narratives within us, and it's about how we choose to tell this story that will help us determine where we will continue to grow. It is a story that I see deeply held within the Methodist Church as well. What is the origin story of who we are and how we have come to be who we are? For a simple fact of the matter, I've always wondered why we can have a logo that has a cross and a flame. In my mind, that just tells me that clearly you didn't probably talk to any black people when we were coming up with this logo. And I said that to say there's an origin story here. There's a reason why they wouldn't have talked to black people when they came up with this, because of the histories of segregation that were latent in the history of our church. So recognizing our origin stories, I think, is critical for us as we decide and discern who we are going to be. Unfortunately, for so long within our history, we have glorified conquest. We have, as Dr. Kamen illustrated, borrowed deeply and heavily from these conquest narratives to create an imaginatory picture of who we are. She writes on page 99, the discourse of the conquest narratives has had a broad ideological afterlife far beyond ancient Judah. Temporally, geographically, and culturally, these narratives have shaped us. They have not only shaped our church traditions, but indeed they have, in fact, shaped our understanding of how we as Americans or we as Christians relate to the rest of the world. And to deny that would be to deny a deep reality. It would be to pretend as though we can exist outside of systems that indeed shape us. I think as I read her book, I kept coming back to our current circumstance, and that's what I'm going to spend the next few minutes talking about, our current circumstance with respect to the rise of white Christian nationalism. And I was drawn to this book I've read by Gorski and Perry called The Flag and the Cross. They define white Christian nationalism and identify white Christian nationalists using a constellation of beliefs. These beliefs reflect the desire to reset and privilege the myths, values, identity, and authority of a particular ethnocultural tribe and put other tribes in their quote-unquote proper place. This is the same tactic. It is the same strategy. It is the same program that we talked about earlier within the book. It is just being replicated again. And it's happening among us right now. Like right now in this particular space. So this book cannot be more timely. It could not be more critical for us to understand how we have got to our current social moment. There is a deep story of Christian nationalism that we must unpack, that we must tell, that we must understand so we can, as Dr. Kamen mentioned, figure out how we got to where we are today. What I mean by deep stories is that deep stories are stories that are told over and over, reframed and recast to uphold an interpretation of history that one believes to be true, though it may not factually be true. What makes deep stories stories is that they function like a basic movie script. They have heroes, they have villains, they have well-worn and familiar plots and events that we're all supposed to be able to easily follow. What makes these stories deep is that the story has been told and retold many times and across many generations, and that they've been retold so much that they feel true. They're truthy, you know? It's like, it's not true, but it just feels like it should be what is true, even though this deep story is more myth than actual history. And so it's helpful for us to, I believe, understand how this story that we heard today from Dr. Common is in alignment with the deep story of white Christian nationalism. The deep story that they tell themselves is that America was founded by and as a Christian nation by white men who were quote-unquote traditional Christians, and that these founding documents were based on quote-unquote Christian principles. They believe the U.S. was blessed by God, which is why it's so successful, that the U.S. has a special role to play in God's plan for humanity, that the blessings of God on the U.S. are under threat from cultural degradation and un-American influences, both domestic and abroad. And the simple fact of the matter is, quite honestly, the target is domestic. The rhetoric that you hear within these spheres is deeply about the enemy within. It is domestic in this sense, and it is an attack on trying to determine who gets to tell the story of who we are as a country. This deep story of white Christian nationalism casts a political vision similar to the vision that you talked about in your book, a vision of what a nation should be and how it ought to get there. Within our contemporary context, we can say that the deep story of white Christian nationalism believes in an unholy trinity of freedom, order, and violence. Freedom for them is understood in a libertarian way as freedom from restrictions, especially from government restrictions. Order is understood in a hierarchical way, with white Christian men at the top and discerning who is in power and giving the orders. And violence is seen as righteous means of defending freedom and restoring order. However, the means for defending freedom and restoring order are reserved for white Christian men or people who want to uphold the freedom and order of white Christian men. Not everybody has access to violence in the same kinds of ways. And it is this unholy trinity of freedom, order, and violence that we actually see in the book of Joshua being replicated in our contemporary movement today. It is key for us to understand this unholy trinity, to understand the religious and political vision that is being purported right now. And so I think the question that we have to ask ourselves as we are discerning how we move forward is who do we want to be as people of faith? The question that confronted the writers of the book of Joshua, the questions that confront all of us who are seeking to be liberated from oppression is, do we find ourselves fighting for liberation from oppression or for equality with our oppressors? This is the choice. And to be clear, when I'm saying about white Christian nationalism, I don't want all the white people in here to believe I'm just talking about white people, because I know there are some white Christian nationalists who look like me. One of them serves on the Supreme Court, and I know y'all know who I'm talking about. Another one of them is running for governor in North Carolina, and I know y'all know who I'm talking about. And so the question is, we have to ask ourselves, who is it that we want to be? I believe that no matter what we look like or where we come from, most of us want to live in communities where we trust our neighbors. Most of us want to live in the right relationship with our neighbors. Regardless of our race, regardless of our background, regardless of our gender and sexual orientation, most of us want our families to feel a sense of peace and security and want to feel a sense of belonging. For far too long, historians, politicians, and clergy leaders have been more invested in equality with oppressors rather than liberation from oppression. They have sought to convince us that if we follow in the footsteps of the conqueror, that we too could join them in enjoying the spoils of war. These leaders believe that we are not smart enough or determined enough to create counter-narratives that move us towards a notion of justice and freedom. They believe that we cannot resist the lure of their supposed power. They believe that we are not wise enough to be turned away from their spoils. But in the same way that we see Jesus resist temptation in the desert, we too know what it means to drink from the wisdom of the ancestral wellspring that has taught us that we can tell a story about our country that moves people towards a more inclusive democracy. We know we can tell a story that can expand voting rights because we have done that in the past. We know we can tell a story that expands reproductive justice because we have done this in the past. We know we can tell a story that expands the civil rights for disabled people because we have done this in the past, and we can tell a story that expands the civil rights for queer people because we have done this in the past. We must remember we have been constantly recreating and retelling stories. This is not new. This is something that we can do. And so for us as people of faith, the call is clear. We need to recreate counter-narratives that tell a new and more accurate story of how we have come to be who we are as people of faith. We need to develop and practice within our liturgical calendars a season of origins. I'm so excited by the last chapter of your book, and I will be among the clergy who will be teaching. I wish I had read it weeks ago because I would have been teaching it now. I would have been teaching it in October. It is so profoundly moving, and it's so important because one of the things I have learned in my own congregation, that's a progressive Christian congregation, where so many people that come to this space are suffering from trauma that we've all talked about. They bring that baggage, and the thing about putting it in our annual liturgy is that it's an invitation to return to it each year, because each time new people come to our church, or even people who've been there for a year, we can still get sucked into those old narratives and those old ways of thinking, those old ways of viewing ourselves, that we can almost forget who we actually are. So this is an invitation to remember, to spend time remembering who we are, to understand the structural evil that has tried to give us a vision that we know is not consistent with who we are, so that we know that we can tell the story another way. Indeed, as Howard Thurman says, is an invitation for us as people of faith, but also as a church community, to find the sound of our genuine. Dr. Common writes, the Season of Origins creates a yearly opportunity to focus on the work of undoing conquest, to facilitate healing the wounds of the past, to imagine the change we need for the challenges of the present moment, and to integrate the Highland settlement story into the Christian tradition. Sherry discussed the ways in which that ought to happen, so I don't need to say any more on that. I will end by pleading, honestly, for this to be something that we build into the ways in which we do church, that we take this time before we enter into our Advent season to remember who we are, to listen to the sound of our genuine, to be able to distinguish that sound from the other voices and noises and gongs that go on inside of us, so that we can reconnect with ourselves. And as Thurman says, as we do this, it's an opportunity for us to be able to hear and listen to the sound of the genuine in others, to reconnect to who they are. Imagine the possibilities, the interfaith possibilities, the possibilities of us to be able to connect with others across difference if we can be settled into who we are, knowing that we can be in relationship without conquering, but we can be in relationship through community and love. And that is who we are. That is the essence of who we are. Thank you for the opportunity to read this book and to share a few words. I think we're all going to sit there.
You want a few questions?
Yeah, I'm going to do a very quick response, and then we'll open up for questions.
I have no idea how to turn this off, Richard, so I'm like, I got nothing. There we go. I figured it out. Anyway.
Thank you, Dr. Carter, Dr. Stroud, and Dr. Bach. I'll just say a few remarks and then we'll go right into questions. I mean, I think what Dr. Carter is saying and what's reiterated by Dr. Stroud and Dr. Bach is that these stories are so deeply written onto our bodies that the healing work is really going to take a lot. Yeah. And so my sense of personal call is for the progressive churches, for churches to take up that mantle and say, we've got to do really big things right now to meet this moment, because the white Christian nationalists are doing really big things right now. Right. And so we've got to, and I think it's an opportunity for us to be public about our faith and say, we're doing this big change. We're going to take responsibility for these past conquests. And for all the layers of trauma, whether we're talking the militaristic trauma around the world and then the immigrant communities coming here, bringing those traumas in with them and then experiencing a whole nother level of trauma. Whether it's just the ways in which this story has played out in this country alone. And so I do think, yeah, that's why I went with the Season of Origins, and I'm excited because I'm feeling like there's energy around it. Because it's like I want us to do those big things. Yeah, so I'll just say one thing else is that Dr. Stroud talked about Norman Gottwald. He's very dear to my heart. I've never met him, and he passed away about 2 years ago. His work in the 1960s, he was in Berkeley, California during the Vietnam protests and studying the Hebrew Highland settlements. And that he noticed there, this story means something for us now. We need to tell this story. He told that story in the best way that he could in a 900-page tome. Good luck, all of you. I did read most of it. But I'll just say this. The publisher of my book, Orbis Books, originally published Dr. Gottwald's text, The Tribes of Yahweh, in 1979, the year I was born, so somehow I feel connected to this. And when I read his book, and I was just like, felt this intuition, this story needs to be told. And so I spent, 12 years getting a PhD to tell this story. And when I brought it to Orbis Books, when they read it, they got back to me and said, we don't know you, but for 20 years we were trying to get Dr. Gottwald to write a 200-page book that people could understand and to interpret what this means for the church. And so they were like, you're a godsend, because Dr. Gottwald passed away 2 years ago and he never wrote that book. I never had a chance to talk with him, but my book is now nicknamed Little Gottwald at Orbis Books. So yeah, so it feels like a full circle. But so I just want to say that, and I'll speak to Beth's point about the chicken and egg. Colonizers are going to colonize. Yeah. Right. They don't need the conquest story. But what the conquest story did was help them sleep at night and say, hey, God's calling us to do this. Wow. It was just such a perfect pattern to fit the paradigm, because the paradigm is much bigger than Judah in 640 BCE. It plays out time and time again. And so both of those stories are in our own bodies. They're in our biblical texts. And we need to be good stewards of those stories and our biblical texts, our sacred texts, to unpack where these stories show up in our own lives, where they show up in our texts, and how can we say no to certain stories and yes to others. And so, thank you. We're open for questions. And we got about 25 minutes, so.
This is it's kind of blew me away, because I just sent out to my worship committee my Advent plan to do the genealogy of Matthew and the foremothers of Jesus, because it is a narrative way that builds in all that undercutting. Yeah. And it's really interesting that Rahab, the wife of Uriah, and Ruth are all kind of at these critical turning points till you get to Mary. And it's like a preface to the Prince of Peace. undercutting the conquest narratives. So I wanted to hear, you talk a little bit more about now, how I'm going to do that in Advent sermons, I don't know, but Advent sermons are always hard, right? I would like to hear you talk more about developing the underside of history of our narratives, of the narratives we have, maybe without having to do biblical archaeology along the way. I don't know.
My mic? Okay. Hello? Hey, let me turn off this one. Yeah, I think fundamental to a feminist theological approach and also a womanist theological approach is really telling the stories differently and getting below the surface and assuming, okay, we've been given patriarchal traditions, but women have been there all along. And their stories are very often there, but we have to have, ears to hear and hermeneutical approaches to help us dig up their stories and tell them. So I think very much like you're saying, following that thread in the genealogy in Matthew really points us towards these liberative and subversive sources in some ways. And we can do that work, and I think feminists and womanists in particular do that work and show us ways in which to do them. So you certainly don't need to go into biblical archaeology like I did, but exactly. Maybe not recommended for everybody, but anyone else want to add? Thanks, Colleen.
I mean, I would just say as a pastor, I tend to, with my sermons, when I know it's going to be a topic or I know I'm going to be talking about something that's going to be unsettling, I want to always frame it in a way that gives people a sense that they can trust me, that where I'm taking them is someplace they're going to want to go. So what can I say in the beginning? I'm like, no, I need you, just trust me, because where we're going to end is going to, liberation is not always, it's often going to be painful. It's going to be, and so, but at the end we grow. And so just naming that I found to be helpful. And I think the fact that you're doing these stories at this time and that you are a woman gives you a particular privilege about how we might center this voice and why it needs to be centered. And so just trust your instincts and just know and help people know that where you're going to take them, that you're going to do it, you are going to bring them in a place that they need to go, but you're doing it in a way that is for their benefit and for their liberation. And you're going to be cautious and careful and loving.
I would like to hear you say just a little bit more about the United Kingdom. I was really interested when you were talking about the time of Josiah as probably the first time that we really saw that kind of wealth in Jerusalem, and yet we have those stories of Solomon. I'm so fascinated by all of this, and this is a teeny tiny little question that was just sitting with me. So I would love to hear more about that from any of the scholars.
Yeah, so not a biblical scholar. Know a lot about these certain perspectives. I don't really know about the reign of Solomon. I know, yeah, they talk about the wealth, and that may have been true, and Dr. Kim's not here to help out, so I'm like, but I will say the research shows that, well, we have our New Testament scholar, that's true. I didn't know if you were going into the Iron Age, Ryan, so, okay. It does seem that with Assyria being close to the north, and there was this flood of resources into Judah and Jerusalem at that time, that it's the first time there's a noticeable wealth class showing up in Judah. Very interesting question. I don't know if Dr. Schellenberg wants to take a stab. Or...
I don't think I have anything to say to that.
Okay.
Maybe just more retelling of this one. Maybe just more retelling of their own ancient story.
Yeah, I mean, I think when we're unpacking the biblical texts, especially very early biblical texts, so Solomon, we're thinking like 10th century, 9th century, storytelling and inflation of storytelling and how we're talking about our own narratives versus what really happened on the ground, it's sometimes they align and sometimes they don't, as we saw with the Conquest narrative. But yeah, I'd be interested to learn more about that. Thank you.
I'm just curious about, like, I'm a liturgical person. I grew up in the United Methodist Church. I love it. Like, but as I'm interacting with Christians of all different flavors, brands, when I talk about liturgy, their brain, like, liturgical calendar, like, what are you talking about? And as someone who does not have a church home, the liturgical calendar is something that runs my family. So I'm just really curious about, like, how this incredible learning and these incredible themes, like, how do we take that beyond, like, to, like, I think a lot about some white national spaces and, like, even progressive church spaces, and how there is no anchoring in the liturgical calendar. And I'm just curious about you all's thoughts about bringing these incredible themes, like, I'm about to do something in Charleston with this, thank you, like, into that larger church space when the liturgical calendar doesn't extend to so many.
Great question, and I'll add to it, and then I'd love to hear what other folks say. Basically, the idea of the liturgical season is a theological grounding for this work, but for me, the most important thing is that the work is returned to every year within a congregation. So sometimes liturgy might really speak to a community, and a liturgical calendar does. Other times it doesn't. But I wanted to at least start the scaffold of something that could be returned to with enough time that we could actually do some work in that 4 weeks every year. Because my experience, again, I'm a limited person, but in progressive church spaces that had a very justice-oriented focus, there would be a book study, there would be, we would talk about justice in the pulpit, there would be like the MLK Day of Service, but it was like we weren't diving in with any depth with the whole community. And I'm like, if we keep just having like a book study, the same 10 folks are going to show up. If we're just doing a day of service, we don't have enough time to be like, what about our own healing? What about our own response? What's the history and the origins of this church right here? What were we doing, in the 1800s or not? So I wanted to create a frame that had enough space each year that we could do stuff, but then we could return to it and build that. But I don't see it as just liturgy. I see it as a time and space of like, this is when we're going to do the book study together. This is when we're going to do connect with our local community and the reparations committee there, and like, how can our church get involved? This is where we're going to, invite a healing circle for naming our own, wounds from our own experiences of conquest. So I think it extends out. But it's just, how do we, and it's going to be different for every church, which is why, at least for next year, I tried to get a variety of churches as I could in 5 churches. Because I know this is going to play different in the Black church. This is going to play different in an Indigenous American church, in a multi-diverse church, or a white church. So it's not going to be one season of origins that we just pre-package and you go out and do it. It's like, no, each community is going to have very different things to focus on in those 4 weeks. But the point is that they have those 4 weeks every year to name it and do it.
And I would just add that, a congregation that doesn't have a tradition of a liturgical calendar and liturgical seasons, that doesn't know like Advent and Lent and ordinary time, can still have seasons, like a season of fasting, or a season of repentance, or a season of renewal.
I'll just say probably 80% of my congregation doesn't know anything about liturgical calendars. I use those terms. Like, I'd be like, this is Advent, this is Lent, and I tell them what that is, and I do say that every year. But that's just not, those were created during a particular era of Protestant Christianity, especially, where there was just this assumption, or there was this massive church growth, and so we knew people could have a common conversations around certain passages, right? That doesn't, what I do as a pastor is I still have an outline of what I'm going to be talking about up until after Lent, right? And so I still operate on the same calendar. It's just written down, but I think Dr. Common's point about the fact that it's something that should be returned to annually, and that, I think, is something, I would argue that this is a practice that we in the faith community need to sit down and take seriously what does it mean for us to not only educate our congregation over these particular topics, but figure out ways to deepen certain values over the course of a calendar year. And so, for instance, like my church, and I am actually going to say, we do some, my church is not, it's very different. It's a conversational community, so we have probably 40 minutes of preaching on a Sunday, but it's split in two. It used to be like 25 minutes of preaching, but they hired me, and I'm like, hey man, this is, black pastor, you gonna get? I'm like, I got me talking, and my students know I'm gonna be going deep. So it's, but there's questions and stuff in the way it's woven. So there's conversation built into what we do during worship, and so I think there are ways that you can, even outside of doing a book study, to deepen this, to engage these texts. And so, like, I know when I use this book next year, the book will be on like the pulpit or the area where I preach, so people can see, and we're going to talk about it, and I'm going to quote it. But the last thing I'll say is, we need to find ways where we need to be take seriously the role of repeating certain things every year. So we have at the Loft 4 values that are critical to who we are: compassion, decolonization, conversation, and belonging. And so every summer I do an 8-week series on one of those values, and I do the next 3 weeks after that on the rest. And then I will do, then literally I would do, like in my head already, I've mapped it out for next year, then I would do this. All right. And then it will be Advent. Like it is, but what it does, it gives us an opportunity to say, well, why does decolonization matter? And let us think about this. Why does compassion matter? Why do I call Christianity the spiritual path of radical compassion? And that it's an opportunity for us to deepen and form. And so I say this as someone who would identify mostly as a Christian mystic. Like, we need to take seriously the role of formation in our churches. Mm-hmm. Like, we need to, and that just means taking time to go deep. Like, take the time, make the 4-week series a 6-week series, and just go deep. I feel like there's a thirst there. Like, people really want to know, they want to learn, and most people don't have time to come to graduate school. And so, so this is an opportunity for us to really reach and connect with those people. So, yeah, I totally think it's possible. Just, I would say do it, and just don't tell them what you're doing. They'll never know, Don't use that term. It's fine.
Hi, I'm Kevin. One of the thoughts that I had is, and you didn't mention it exactly in your book, but it's true that there's been this ongoing thing called the season of creation. Have you heard of that?
Yeah, the Episcopal Church.
Episcopal, the Catholic Church, other denominations do that. And for those of you who are not aware of it, season of creation goes every year from September 1st to October 4th. And it's been going on for a while. And the focus is on, being stewards of the earth. And there's even a website. Let's see, it's called seasonofcreation.org. Seasonofcreation.org. And so I just bring that up because that might be, for those of us that are going to start creating a season of origins, we may get some inspiration, actually, and some guidance, and also some imagination. I mean, there's a website called, seasonoforigins.org. Should be coming. Have you made it yet?
It's in the grant. It will be happening.
All right, but I'm just saying. I mean, but there's a model. And it's being done already.
Step by step, but yeah.
So this is just, I think it's just extension of what we're already seeing in the life of the church, of taking seasons, regularly going back. This one's focused on creation, and this season of origins is focusing on something else very important and liberating.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. Actually, I'm working as a theologian in residence at an Episcopal church in my hometown, and they do season of creation. So it's like already in the water that we can change the ways in which we do church. And that's been a great example. I don't cite it in the book because I didn't know about it at the time, but in my grant I talk about it, that like churches are already doing this for really important reasons, and like they're starting to build out new liturgy and new ways of organizing it. And luckily it ends like right before season of origin, so I'm like, oh, that was good. No conflict, didn't know about it, but yeah. So thanks for pointing us towards that.
Over here. I do have my own. Dr. Cummins, so I want to ask about, so the churches that you've chosen look like great churches for the start, but don't match the characteristics of the small, rural, more conservative, open to a different kind of Christianity, but have only ever heard Christian nationalism. What does it look like for them to begin to hear the story?
Yeah, thanks, Justin. So, yes.
You got to start somewhere.
I mean, well, I would say a lot of my students are in those churches right now. And so I gathered these particular churches, but they're certainly not all the churches that could be. But I think it's going to take, what I'm hoping will come out of this study is that there'll be at least a collection of resources, a website. I want to publish another book around like, okay, Season of Origins. Here's what we tried. Here's what kind of worked here. Here's a template. So that folks that are like, oh, I want to do Season of Origins don't have to invent that from scratch, so we can get some data, that we can get some resources. And ultimately, it's really in that context, I think about it all the time in my like leadership courses, which you know. It's like, how do I do the interpretive work of breaking this down and inviting people into a conversation where they're at, and what is the digestible chunk that that I can start bringing these ideas in. When we're talking about undoing conquest, it's challenge the very research of the book challenges a biblicist hermeneutic. So if your folks are like, the Bible is inerrant, it's biblicist, you know, like there's work there before you're going to invite in a conversation around, guess what, the conquest narrative probably didn't happen that way. Like they're already throwing you out of the church if you say that. So there's probably going to be some interpretive work to be done there, and I think I'd love to stay in conversation with folks that are doing that work. And so, who knows, maybe we'll add a sixth church if we get some money.
I would add to that you know, a place to begin maybe is with the conquest study of the conquest narrative itself, because I think you know, even in a very rural, fairly conservative church, I think a congregation kind of reading the book of Joshua closely could pretty quickly say, this is not who we want to be. You know, so what do we do? And that could be a place to launch the conversation.
Great point, Beth.
If you didn't have a liturgical tradition, a natural place to maybe have a conversation is around the national holiday of Thanksgiving, which is when we really pull out when we really run into the conquest narrative that all kids are taught, and that almost all kids are also aware of, doesn't really make very much sense and doesn't feel real.
Yeah, that's another great, it's like Indigenous Peoples Day and Thanksgiving are kind of these bookmarks where these topics are already there. Yeah.
I know it's 3:30, so I want to say this before we wrap up, and it's kind of to tie what I heard you say in June in your presentation and the end of the book, Dr. Common, was the way in which trauma is so embedded in why these stories were created. And it made me wonder, how might we, in the four movements you have at the end of the book, make sure that, I would say within the first or second movement, the names of them escape me, but we take the time to do that kind of inward turn to tend to the trauma that we carry as individuals and we carry as religious communities that has led us to believe to buy into these conquest narratives, right? Because there's something within us that makes us feel like if we don't, this fear, what's underneath the desire for these narratives to be true? And this is what I was thinking as you were giving your presentation, like that's a trauma response when you feel like this is the only way I can be safe, right? As if I buy into this. And so like, that's how I saw the connection between y'all's presentations is how do we make sure we're intentionally healing that unmet need so that these congregations you named, like that's what has to happen so they can move past that biblicist framework, right? That internal fear and insecurity. I guess last way I say is I guess I see more potential development in a conversation between y'all two about the way trauma is at play in this particular, in that framework.
No, and I think that week of name, so it's invite, name, repair, imagine. Name is where I imagine like some churches are really going to be naming like what is my complicity in the past, but also what are the traumas I'm carrying. Some churches are going to be focused on like what are the traumas that I've experienced versus how have I been a perpetrator. But it's like, and this is where I would love to connect with trauma theologians and like how can there be communal practices for both? That we as a community can be like, okay, we named it, but how do we repair it? How do we create communal healing for ourselves and for our communities? And how can we lead our towns to do that in a public way?
Yeah, just one of the things that I wanted to add is just related with trauma. Like, trauma kind of like, it is really hard to recognize those traumatic wounds because it remains as a silence, right? It remains as a silence, secrets, and gaps in history. So, yeah, we've been heard a lot about this conquest narrative in the church, but it really reminds me of, have we ever heard about those silence in the church? And then whether do they have a language? Do they have the stories? And then that is the thing that we should think about it. And then how can we make a room for those peoples who've been untold and be silenced, and to let their stories also be told in the church communities. And also the hidden stories that Dr. Comment point out that really remind me of what are the hidden stories in our church communities? What are the hidden stories in our Christian communities? And then how can we let them to speak their languages and to speak their voices? Yeah.
Thank you, Jihan. All right, that was our final word.